And good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming back. I am super excited about this. We have, of course, I'm sure you all know, Chris, who's doing this with me. We all know Chris. He's here. And hey, Michael, glad to see you show up. And the reason why this one is so exciting, if you don't already know, but you already know, we've got Jennifer Brick with us. So my mouse is being so dumb. There we go. There's Jenny.
Hey, how's it going?
I got this new wireless mouse and the surface of my desk is not completely smooth. So
it's having a fit.
It's one of those things. Yeah.
You have to be old school and get a mouse pad.
Yeah, I'm going to have to do something. So anyway, we've got Jenny, we've got Chris, we've got me. We're here for ending the stigma. So thank you for showing up. This is a super important topic to all of us, and we are glad to open this discussion publicly and get some of your input and reaction to what we have to say. So Jenny, when we were talking about bringing you on,
yes,
one of the things that you were particularly interested in talking about is restorative justice.
Mm-hmm.
So can you explain to our audience what that actually means?
Yes. And I feel like it's something that if people have heard of it, they probably imagine it as like a sage ceremony where everyone is like holding hands and singing Kumbaya, and there's maybe some swing and some crying and stuff like that. And maybe it can be a little bit like that, but typically it isn't. So I stumbled into restorative justice really accidentally. So my degree is in criminology. So this explains how I came about studying restorative justice. I was in school studying crime. And one of the classes that I ended up falling into, because my university, I went to Simon Fraser University. It's up in Canada. And a lot of the professors and a lot of the people that were studying for their master's degree and PhD were really looking into restorative justice and the potential that research was actually seeing in it. So restorative justice is very different because it is based on predominantly Indigenous justice systems, so healing circles, victim offender mediations, and things like that. And it's really built on the premise of healing a community when something has happened, as opposed to isolating the victim and isolating the offender. And so I ended up kind of in this class because I think it fit my schedule. It wasn't because I'm like, oh, like, what is this thing? It was completely by accident the first year that I was at SFU. And I ended up becoming absolutely fascinated. We had a lifer come in and speak to us who had been convicted of first-degree murder. He ended up becoming a restorative justice advocate within prison systems and just started to get to know the restorative justice community, which was really it's quite a thing at the university. And even just going through the course, it was really focused on mediation, understanding, and empathy and listening. And I just, from the studies and the research that we discovered over that process, it was really powerful. And it was like, I know it's not something for every single case and every single person. And there's a lot of different ways that it can show up. And if you guys want to dive into those, I'm happy to talk about, I'm not a leader in that industry, just to preface.
Right.
I have friends who are, so if you want names, I can definitely refer people who literally teach it at university. But it is something that I saw a lot of opportunity within, because being someone who has been a victim or has been victimized in the past, I know that my feeling about people who have been the offenders was complex, and that I don't think that as a again, I don't mean just keep on throwing up the air quotes because I don't like calling myself a victim, but as someone who has been victimized, I didn't derive any healing from someone else being punished.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense. Or the thought of someone else being punished. So yeah, that's something that I'm still very passionate about. And I worked for a short time in a criminal law firm because I was supposed to be a lawyer. It's a very long, complicated story. But it was very interesting because the cases that I was interacting on, I actually saw several cases where it would have been such a more powerful and a such more productive like option for people who were otherwise just being like recycled through the criminal justice system. So long story short, TLDR, restorative justice, healing.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And, you know, I wish, like, I know that during my time in prison, seeking out different avenues to really help myself become a better person, like I really had to go out of my way to find that. Like I really had to, you know, in some cases, like fight the system just to make some of these things happen that, you know, are really just about me being a better person. And, you know, it shouldn't be that difficult for someone to say, hey, I want to get better. I want to figure out what's going on with me. I want to, you know, like one of the things that I did was, and I actually did it for a few years, was a cognitive behavior therapy that was kind of offense specific. And, you know, the waiting list to get in, I mean, it was something that was offered by the system, but the waiting list to get into it was about 2 years long. And
so it's super accessible.
Right. So I mean, it was
only there for a while.
Right. It was only offered at one facility. So in the state of Colorado, we have 28 different facilities. So this was only offered at one facility. It had a 2-year-long wait list, and you know, it was just hell trying to get into it. But you know, I'm kind of ignoring the comment. I don't know what Chris's experience was with different things like that. Let's bring him into the conversation.
Uh-oh, we can't hear Chris now.
Now we can't hear you, Chris. What happened?
There's a little button on the front.
Nope, you're still not there.
That might have been. Okay. New microphone problems. Well,
and yes, Kevin, I did all of the ABCs. I did CBT, I did RBT, I did ERT, I did RST. I mean, all of the different things. So
we still can't hear you. Chris, there's a little button on the front of the microphone. Oh, there you go.
There you go.
Gotcha.
I bet I can plug these back in now.
Yes.
That's what I get for trying to try out new things without enough time to do it. All right. So yeah, it was kind of the same thing where I was. You couldn't, so I had to take some therapy type stuff too, and I could not take it before I made parole. So I had to wait until I made parole. So that was not a preemptive thing I could do on my part. It was, okay, you made parole, now you have to go take this class. There was a couple of classes. One was called cognitive intervention. That was kind of just some basic cognitive restructuring kind of stuff. And the other one was called changes. Changes was also not optional. It was something they put you in just whenever they decided to. But they don't make it to where you can proactively go take this stuff beforehand so that it's on your, in Texas, it's called the ITP, your individual treatment program or whatever. They don't make it to where you can do that on your own. They wait to put you in it. So you kind of get stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Right. But I mean, even besides that,
we have
some of the other things that, you know, should be more accessible and more easy to get into, like in the Colorado prison system, 7 habits is a big thing. But depending on the facility that you're at, the waiting list to get into 7 habits can be 6 months, a year, 2 years long, just to get into the program. And, you know, different programs like that are offered. I know that at one facility that I was at, they were a lot more lax. It was actually one of the private prisons. So they were a lot more lax on some of those rules, and they would let us as inmates, as long as we could find a staff sponsor, they would let us start programs. and do them. Just as long as we had a staff sponsor and a room to meet in, they would let us do it basically on our own. So, but that was one facility. So
yeah, no, I'm like, so the thing that makes me like really curious about this is that, you know, the concept of prison is to reform people. Like that's on the books what it's supposed to, like it's not supposed to be a penal system anymore. That was supposed to go away a long time ago with penitentiaries, which you can argue if those are actually gone. They're not.
Right. No.
But you know, but like essentially, like if you look at like the fundamentals of the system is that, especially in America, where the prison industrial complex is one of the largest industries and one of the biggest money makers, especially when we factor in private industry, private technology, private prisons. There's so much money in the game that it's not in the best, like I fundamentally question if the point is to actually reform people who want to be reformed, because consent is very important here. You can't reform someone who doesn't want to change. But at that moment where someone wants to make a change in their life and they want to like take this time for what it's supposed to be to like go within and, you know, not return to just like do more crime, you need to have better systems in place, and there has to be better programs, and there has to be better access, and there has to just be like structurally more ways for people to actually succeed coming out the other side. Because you guys have talked about it, like you're released with like $50 and like maybe someone actually comes to pick you up. If not, here's a bus ticket. Like, and how is that staging someone for success after they've served time? And so there's that huge thing of like, okay, well, what's the actual goal here? And the goal here, like it feels like to me, my opinions, is that it is to cycle people through, because that does make money for people. But then the other thing is that when we look at the way that crime is that, so in criminology, and I like Nathan, I know that you don't like these terms, but we like from a research perspective, we talk about victim and we talk about offender. So there's these two people in the context of a crime. Now, restorative justice takes into consideration the community, because for both the victim and for the offender, they are not the only ones impacted by a crime. And again, crime is all a social construct, just to like be clear on that one. But like, so let's say that someone comes and steals my favorite necklace. So like the person who stole my necklace, if they get caught, and even if they don't get caught, they have been impacted by that event. And I am impacted by that event. But maybe it was like something that was like from my grandmother, and now my dad is upset, and like there's other people that are impacted by every single thing. So we also have to consider the community and then the trust, safety, and security that the community feels. And what ends up happening, and like I really want to actually get your take on this, is because I think right now the way that we approach crime is that it's excluding both the victim and the offender from society. Afterwards, especially when we look at more serious crimes, assaults and stuff like that, we have so many stigmas. Like maybe if someone steals my necklace, they're like, well, you should have put it in a safe, and they're blaming me for it. And I'm like, I'm just living my life and someone came and jacked my stuff, right? Like, how am I to blame? But that's what we do. But then we're also blaming the offender of like, how dare you? So we have these two people that are like carrying the shame of this event. And like, so like now I'm shamed. The person who stole the necklace is shamed. And like, how does that help us restore as a society?
One thing that I think is really sad, and you see this specifically within the context of sexual crimes, but also other types of assault and things like that, where the prosecutor or the courts, the system, is basically, you know, they're coddling, that's the wrong term, but the victim, and you know, through this whole process and getting the statements, and you know, and then as soon as they get their conviction, that person is just like dead to them, essentially. Like they can't get in touch with anyone. They're not getting help. I mean, obviously they need some kind of trauma therapy, some kind of ongoing emotional support, but as soon as that conviction lands, like they're just cast aside.
And like victim services stops. We don't care about you anymore.
It's done at that point. So, I mean, I know that we've been talking about the need for rehabilitation for offenders and, you know, the way that the system works in that regard, but it also works on the other side too. Like, yes, 100%. Like in my case, I was guilty, Okay. I was convicted for a reason. I was guilty. I went to prison for a reason.
Mhm.
And I went out of my way to do what I had to do to become a better person so that when I was released from prison, I could be a better person and not hurt anyone again.
Mhm.
But on the other side of that equation, like, I don't think that it's fair to the victim in my case that, you know, they were essentially just cast aside. And I guarantee that that person needed, you know, more support and more counseling and more than what the system was prepared to offer.
Well, and I think also like we have to speak to this as well, is that even going through the process, there is victim services, at least in Canada. I assume that there is in the States as well. I don't think that they provide really a lot. And especially depending on the crime, like you're having someone relive their trauma like over and over and over, because they're living their trauma again to file a police report. They're living their trauma again to like talk to investigators. They're reliving the trauma because now they have to talk to their friends and their family and their therapists. And then they're talking to the lawyers, and then they're talking like the prosecutor, like then they have to get onto a stand, and like then they're going to be dragged and like blamed. And there's all of the stigma that attaches to them. And I totally think that you're right. And I think this is one thing. And like, so, and this was actually the moment that I knew I couldn't be a lawyer, is that I sat in at a sentencing, and I was in a criminal defense firm, and the offender, it was an underage victim. It was a child, and it was a child that was under his care regularly with her younger siblings. And he did plead guilty, and I never thought I would feel bad for someone who had harmed a child. I honestly did. And like, if you've been heard about what's happening in Canada, all of the news is coming out about the residential schools, and just like they were cesspools of abuse, emotional, psychological, like sexual, like every level of abuse. Children were being killed, buried in the backyard kind of deal. So this person was a residential school survivor who actually ran away from the residential school at 13 and started going into prison instead. So, and he was older. He was going to die in prison. He just lived this like life, just victim, like a victim of circumstance and a victim of society, like through no wrongdoing of his own. It was just like, that was the stage that was set for him. So he was going to die in prison. And I genuinely, I felt bad for him. And I didn't think that that was possible. And this is where I was like, I can never be so jaded to not, like, I can't believe I feel this way, but I also don't want to be so jaded that I need to be making like the jokes that you need to make in order to kind of cope with this.
Right.
But the breaking point for me was at the end, the girl who's, again, she was very young. Her mother had brought her to the sentencing hearing. And I didn't necessarily like, especially now as a parent, I don't necessarily agree with that happening, but it was her daughter, her choice. And the little girl ran up to the prosecutor after, and she was like, it's over, like, it's done, because he was going to jail. And I was just like, oh, girl, like, it's not over. It's not over for you. Like, you're a young child. Like, you need years of therapy. You probably won't get that. Her mother was an alcoholic, which is why she was leaving her with this man in the first place. And so it was just like, you can just see the cycle. And this is where, like, it was the only case that the lawyer I worked with felt the need to debrief me after. And he was like, what did you think? And I was like, this is actually, to me, a great opportunity for restorative justice, because these were people who were functioning as somewhat of a family unit. And not saying that this is, again, right for everyone, but like some sort of like, he had actual genuine guilt. And it would have been aligned with community standards for their community. And again, they just shipped him off to prison. Who knows where she is now? I hope she's okay.
Right.
But that was that. I was just like, you know, and the lawyer I worked with and the prosecutor, like, again, like, you have to be you end up jaded no matter what behind the scenes when that's what you do. And I was just like, I don't see that this is a system that's healing anyone. Yeah. And I want to do that. Like, what I want to do is I want to heal people. Like, I want people to get over their trauma, not just relive it in perpetuity.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, that's kind of one of the deals, like, you know, Texas is known for being pretty harsh as far as, you know, sentencing and stuff like that. And I never did get it, even when I was in law enforcement. You know, I get it. You kill somebody, get life or whatever. You have to do 30 years on an aggravated life sentence here before you can even be considered for parole. And there's no guarantee you're going to make your first parole.
Yeah.
So what, and my whole deal was, okay, you do your crime, you do the time. What good is keeping them in there any longer than 30 years going to do?
So
anybody.
there was a big thing in Colorado. So first of all, in the state of Colorado, life means life. Like if you get a life sentence, life means life, period.
Inside?
Yes.
Really?
Yeah,
No
if you get a life sentence, you do not get the opportunity for parole, period, in the state of Colorado.
Wow. See, Texas doesn't have a life without parole, except in the case of, it's fairly new, ongoing sexual assault of a child is a new charge, where if they can prove that it was an ongoing, constant thing, then you can get life without parole. Other than that, there is no life without parole in prison in Texas.
But in the state of Colorado,
but also, again, like we need to remember the humanity in it. In Canada, so there is a life sentence for first-degree murder, but it's parole after 25 years. You can start applying for parole. You might not ever get out.
Right.
But there is it's a faint hope clause is what it's called.
So in the state of Colorado, this was maybe, I don't even know how long ago, probably about 2007, 2008-ish. There were something like 50 or 60 men in prison in the state of Colorado who committed murders while they were under the age of 18, but they were tried and convicted as adults and got life without. So this was in like 2007, 2008, maybe even a little bit later than that. There was a huge thing going on where they finally passed something through the legislature where it only affected like these 50 or 60 guys, but they were finally eligible for parole after I think it was 20 years. So, but it was one of those, if they had to be convicted as a juvenile, tried and convicted as an adult. So it had a very limited impact, but I think it was a very huge impact as well because, I mean, again, we're one of the guys who was impacted. I knew him. We were in the same unit together, and he did kill someone. He was guilty, and he was a great guy. Like I would trust him if I had kids, I would trust him with my kids. He was an awesome guy. But 16 years old, he was convicted of first-degree murder.
You know, and if we look at statistically, like someone who commits murder is one of the least likely to reoffend. Like it's just statistically, and even a lot of crimes that we thought previously or like that were assumed to have a high recidivism rate actually have like remarkably lower when you look at the statistics behind it. And even I remember when I was in school, like, you know, learning about sex crimes, and it's like, oh, like, but, you know, when someone is a sex offender, like they're always going to be a sex offender. There's no coming back from that. But it's actually, when you look at the recidivism within 5 years, it's actually quite like, I think it was somewhere between like 20 and 30%, which actually, I mean, not to say it doesn't exist. But
so I've actually done some looking into some of these statistics, and for sex offenders, yes, the recidivism rate is somewhere, depending on the study that you're looking, somewhere between 15 and 25%. But the ones who recidivate for committing another sexual offense, it's less than 5%.
Right. And like, again, and we're still like, no matter what crime we're discussing, from stealing a necklace to sex crimes to murder, we're always assuming that we're talking about we're only talking about the crimes that have been reported, that have been
for sure
convicted, and then they've been found guilty. You know, who's out there running around in the wilds.
Right.
And, you know, of the people that are running around in the wilds, like I actually, like, I wish that we had this kind of like dark figure that we can look at to like expose, like, what is it for the general population versus this? And obviously, like, this is not something that we're going to be able to research. Like, there's just no path to doing it. We can only draw assumptions, but it's not what we like. It's not this big dark, like, okay, like, now you've been branded
Right.
and forevermore. However, we do have a system that does set people up, not necessarily to repeat the same crime, but, you know, as prisons are universities of crime.
Right.
Learn how you go there and you learn how to be a criminal or a better criminal, because for everyone who got caught for one thing, you can find out other ways and things, and, you know.
However, again, based on my experience, that prison university or crime university has a pretty narrow focus as well. And again, it kind of plays out in the statistics too, because the most likely to recidivate are drug crimes and property crimes. Like, by far, not even close for drug crimes. It's like almost an 80% recidivism rate.
Well, and how many property crimes are actually drug crimes? When we look at the motivation behind the crime, like, this is one of the things that, like, studying criminology, I was so disheartened at the end of it, because, like, for the last full-time term that I did, I was working in a law firm and I was earning credits and writing weekly essays and diving into research on different themes that I was seeing. And I had obviously, like, I took a long time to do my bachelor's. I took 6 years. So for 6 years, I was learning all of these criminal theories and strain theory and blah, and this, that, the other thing. And it was like 95% of what I saw was literally like, the person's addicted to drugs, so they're committing crime. Like, that was, they got caught with drugs. They got caught stealing because they needed drugs. They got in a fight because they were high on drugs. They were selling sex because they needed drugs. And, like, that was like 95%. So, like, the number of people that I saw that I could really apply theories outside of healing addiction was, like, remarkably low. And, you know, then you saw, like, the lawyer I work for, I totally stole this line to, like, because I went to a pretty hippie school. The lawyer I work for, he used to say, like, I want to go to rehab is the new I found God. Because in Canada at the time, like, everyone who got caught is like, I don't want to go to prison. I need rehab. I need rehab. And that was, like, the escape button. I don't know if that's ever been a thing here, but, like, everyone coming through. Because, like, but it was because the crime was linked to drugs, and the drugs were because of generally mental illness or marginalization.
Yeah.
And, you know, in Texas, if you have a drug crime and they want to send you to, so most of the time, if you have a drug crime, whenever you make parole, you have to go to either a 5 or a 6 month rehab. But then again, that's another one of those that they only have it at 1 or 2 units. So you can't proactively do it before parole. You have to wait until you make parole. And then the waiting list may be a year. So you have to wait you've made parole. Now you have to try and, one, deal with all the jealous people that are jealous that you made parole. So they're going to try to take away your parole by, you know, doing some kind of crash dummy crap. And then 2, you got to try to keep your nose clean. But then you've already made parole. So you've got to wait another year before you get in the class. And then you have to go another 6 months of rehab. So you've made parole, but it's still going to be a year and a half, year and 8 months, whatever until you get out.
So in the CBT program that I was telling you about, that's only offered at the one facility, they also at that same facility offer drug and alcohol treatment. And I was in that program for about 2.5 years before I was paroled. And in those 2.5 years, there were a few guys that went through the drug and alcohol program, like, joined the program, got halfway house or got paroled, got out, recommitted a crime, came back into the system, got back into drug. Like, there was a few guys who 3 times they showed up in that program.
So how effective is it really?
Right. And this is my thing is, I mean, every crime has a victim, and every crime impacts someone and often multiple people. But if we are looking at the effectiveness of the prison system in reformation, restoration, things like that, we know statistically speaking that drug crimes have a recidivism rate of almost 80%.
Mm-hmm.
And they are able to get into this program and get out multiple times in a 3 to 5 year period. And then you have other people who have a statistically very low recidivism rate, who it takes hell and high water just to get into the program, much less to get out of prison after that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, what? I know these statistics are publicly available. I was able to Google them one morning, the post last week. You can Google this shit and figure it out. So why is everything so ass backwards?
That's why Jenny got out of the criminal justice system.
Right.
Yeah, money.
No,
Exactly.
it's money. And that's like the thing. Because, I mean, even when you look outside of the U.S., because I think it's easy to beat up on the U.S. just because the U.S. kind of takes it to, you know, an American extra level. Like we go big or go home here. But this is true all over the world. Like even in Canada, back in the 90s, the Prime Minister of Canada, the town that he was from was like, there was no jobs. There was a really high unemployment rate. So they like built a prison and then everyone just like works at the prison. But then when you have this prison, you need to fill it up.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, you know, and then it becomes a matter of, okay, so like crime is a social construct. So what do we care about? And like, I think that addiction right now, we're treating as a matter of criminality instead of a matter of a medical issue.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not, you know, addressing the underlying, like, because you can get clean a million times, but there's these other, like, I mean, for obviously with addiction, totally we need to like call Amy in here and it goes so sidebar, but like, it, like most people aren't like doing drugs because they're like super happy living their best lives. It's because there is something there. Like there's a social vacancy, there's an emotional vacancy, there's a psychological reason for it. Like back home in Vancouver, where I'm from, like a lot of it was that the mental health facility was closed. So a lot of the people went onto the streets and, you know, taking drugs was easier and cheaper than taking medication. And probably more fun. Like I'm guessing, especially on the day that like everyone like got their top off because they got their like government check or whatever. Like those days were like, everyone was in a good mood, but like we're not until we address the underlying. And obviously like in the States, there's like this massive addiction problem right now that isn't being dealt with effectively. And it's just being swept under the rug. But it's like when the wrong people are doing drugs and doing the wrong things, then we have a big problem with it, right? Like, so we're like, there's like, it's an unequal system.
So what do you mean that crime is a social construct? Explain that to me.
I mean, it's like if you look at crime over time and space, it changes, right? Murder isn't always bad. You can go to war and you can kill someone and you're a hero.
Right.
You know, like stand your ground laws. Same thing. You like it is now legal to kill someone. It's when you do it because you're mad at them without a valid excuse.
Right.
That, you know, and like, and even like, so the lifer that came and talked to my restorative justice class, like, he shot and killed his ex-wife's new husband because the new husband had assaulted his child. Everyone will uniformly say, like, I get it.
Right.
Doesn't make it right. But it's like, so we even like, I think within the criminality part of like, obviously he went to jail, he got a first degree sentence and things like that. He was very mad for a long time because he thought it should be second degree. But like, doesn't make people less sad. But we excuse things like murder all the time. We also are only focusing on crimes that get caught. Again, like is stealing always wrong? Like is stealing wrong if it's to feed your family because they're starving and they're going to die if you don't steal a loaf of bread?
Right.
Are drugs, like, I mean, look at the state of Oregon because all drugs are legal there now. So like it is something that we have just as a society come up with these morals that we're imposing to have laws about, and we're saying that if you don't do this you're good and if you do this you're bad. Well, at least if you get caught then you're bad.
Right.
If you don't get caught you're smart. I don't know. They like, and they change over time. So we can see that, especially with like, I think one of the biggest movements that we see right now is obviously marijuana. So countries are legalizing it, like in Canada a few years ago, it just went fully legal. A lot of states now, marijuana is legal. There's a lot of people sitting in prisons on marijuana charges right now. The state of Oregon, all drugs being legal, like let's treat this as an actual medical problem that it is.
Right.
So, yeah, that's like, and I can dissect like any kind of crime that you throw at me. It is all something that is just, most things are social constructs that like
Right.
they're just made up, and we kind of agree.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to go back to something you said about, the drugs. There's usually more to it. They're not just doing it just because they're happy. I have to go to group therapy once a month, and my therapist says all the time, whatever the issue was that you went to prison, whether it's drugs or whether it's stealing or whether it's this or whether it's a sex crime or whether it's murder, usually is, let's just say drugs. Drugs are not the problem. It's how the problem presented itself.
Mm-hmm.
So what are we going to do to fix the problem so you don't go back to doing whatever you did to get into prison?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 100%,
Mm-hmm.
100%. I think like all of our behaviors are just like, we as humans, like psychologically, we do things to soothe ourselves. And I'm not saying that like everyone who like does drugs is like doing it to fill a vacancy, because I think that there's just a lot of people who do recreationally use it, and it's not problematic. And we usually see that with less addictive substances. Like, I don't think that anyone's just casually doing LSD in the evenings, but like maybe they are if they're microdosing. I don't know. Like,
Right.
there's all sorts of potential out there. But when we look at like heavy stuff, like I think like for anyone to be like, I need to be out of my mind, whether that's drinking or drugs, there's a reason why you need the escape. Like you're escaping stress, you're escaping emotion, you're escaping a situation. You're not just doing that because you're like, oh, I'm in a great mood. Like maybe you are and you're with your friends and stuff like that. But I would still, in many cases, argue like there's maybe something that is lying underneath of that. And if the people that you're hanging around are all kind of like abusing to like, let's just be out of our mind all the time, maybe it's just a matter of the context that you're putting yourself in, and that there's something underlying that.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely.
Right. So let's kind of shift gears. We've spent more than half an hour on that line of topic, or on that line of conversation regarding problems within the system. So the real point, though, of ending the stigma, and I think that where all three of us feel a bit more passionately, is not, I mean, everybody knows the system is broken, and that's a can of worms that we could go into all on its own. But where we're trying to focus our attention is the way that society itself is stigmatizing these people who are coming out of that system. And what I think is really funny, and it's actually sad more than funny, but if you ask anyone, like practically anyone, if the criminal justice system is broken, they're going to say, oh yeah.
Yeah.
You ask that same person if they would hire someone with a felony background, or if they would, or what their feelings are behind, and they're like, oh no,
Right.
nope. So,
well, I think it's like, so I have a question for you guys on this, because I think most people haven't met or haven't realized that they've met someone who has been formally incarcerated.
Mm-hmm.
So what reaction do you get when people find out that you have served time? Just like socially, like irrespective of like employment.
I cannot think of any specific circumstances where I've received a negative response, or any kind of, serious backlash in a social setting. Most people, I think that it creates surprise. I think that one of the best examples that I can give is, we know Holly Campolongo.
Mm-hmm.
So Holly and I have talked a bit more in depth about my past, and she's said very clearly, like, I've never known anyone before who has who's had a felony background, and
Mhm.
she definitely had a lot of biases and, you know, preconceptions and everything else. And she said straight up, like, knowing you and knowing Chris and hearing your stories and seeing the people you are, like, that's completely changed my mind.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's a pretty standard response, is like, it leads to questions, it leads to surprise, but I've never, at least in a social situation, I've never received any kind of negative backlash out of it.
Yeah, I haven't either. But you know, one thing that we have to our advantage is we don't look like we've been to prison or what Hollywood portrays or what other
Right.
people portray. You
True.
know, I don't have any prison tattoos that are visible.
You're on
I do.
LinkedIn.
I'm on LinkedIn. Yeah, I do have a couple of prison tattoos, but you can't see them. I got one on my chest and one on my foot.
Yeah, mine are on my wrist. Those are my prison tattoos.
We'll have to get into that another time. Um, you know, I'm not out there hustling. I'm not still in the streets. I have a job. You know, I have a life. I have all the things that people don't think felons normally have. So whenever
Mm-hmm.
people say that, it's kind of the same reaction as what Holly is, like, oh my God, like, really? Like, I never ever would have guessed it. But I also made sure when I was in prison, I mean, you're going to be institutionalized to a degree. You can't help
Mm-hmm.
it. You have to survive. But I also
Right.
made sure not to bring that mentality out with me.
Mhm.
You know, about the only thing I brought out with me was I eat corn chips still in everything. I do. Like it's sad,
That's
but like
fair.
as far as the way I think, you know, the way, and I tried not to live like that while I was in prison either. You know, like,
Yeah.
but I was at a low key unit. I didn't have to worry about too much. But I tried not to live like I was still in the world while I was in prison. I mean, you know, you learn to recognize game and not to let people hustle you and all that kind of stuff. But
Yeah.
I tried to live just like that so that when I came out, I wouldn't have that mentality.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And just
Yeah.
the same. I've had the same experience with Nathan. You know, just people are surprised.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's because like we have to fundamentally get to the stigma, and like it starts with just like the beliefs, and I think that they show up differently socially because obviously people have an opportunity to get to know you and then they find out this thing about you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't define who you are whatsoever, but they've gotten to know you as the human outside of that.
And
However,
I was going to say, I make it a point usually to get to know someone before I say something about being in prison.
Right.
yeah.
That's not that,
Absolutely.
oh, hey, I'm Chris. I did 8 years. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Here's my tattoos. Like,
Yeah, here's
no,
my
because
tattoo.
they're gonna react differently. So you have like I think in the social, and I think also like LinkedIn, we're professional, and like
Mm-hmm.
there's this kind of like it's not so scary here, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you meet someone who maybe looks like, and you guys don't look like a typical prisoner in America. So you're also benefiting from that, is that you can pass as
Mm-hmm.
someone because you're not
Right.
like, because most people that are in prison are Black. And so there's also like, there's other things that come into play here. But I think also like, because we were talking about like before we went live is like, you know, and we've talked about before is that, especially in context of employment. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the things like, and Chris, like one of the first conversations I think we had was like about, you know, if someone is released, they need to have a path to success.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't be successful outside of prison if you don't have an income, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I remember learning back in school with people who came that had formerly been incarcerated was that there was just, they got in prison and there was not really paths for them to go. Like if you were
Mm-hmm.
a man, you can work in construction, like you can work at low trust jobs that paid
Mm-hmm.
decently.
Mm-hmm.
But you couldn't, like maybe in a warehouse, maybe you could drive a forklift or something like that. For women, it was harder because women, it was like you're retail, but then you're handling cash. You're not trustworthy if you have a conviction. Or an office, which again, you might not be trustworthy if you have a conviction.
Yeah.
Right.
So women also have some additional stigmas there. And some additional like uphill climb. But like if we can't get people jobs, they can't reintegrate. Like,
Right.
so what we're doing is we're like, okay, so we excluded you and we put you into a cell and we locked you there for however long we did. And that was the time that you were doing. And if that's not supposed to be punishment, I'm not sure what it is. And give you limited access to programs and like means to make yourself successful. But then we're also going to continue to judge you once you're on the outside. And like, yeah, we want you to be successful, but like maybe I don't want to give you a job. And then you hit the wall there where you're like, I'm just trying to add value. I'm just trying to be a good person or whatever that definition is. And then you hit walls. And then when like, I think that everyone has their own level of resilience of how many walls they can hit before they're like, F it, because society doesn't want me. I don't want society.
Right.
Exactly. And that's one of the leading, I've said it time and time again, is I don't know what the statistics are, but I know that is a high percentage of the cause of recidivism right there.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And
either they can't get a job or they're making $10 an hour with no hope of making any more, maybe 12, maybe 15 if they're lucky, but it's still all hourly where, you know, if they get rained out, they're not making any money. You know, there's no paid vacation, there's no benefits, there's no nothing. Like it's under the table, $10 an hour. That's $400 a week, man. Who the else can live on $400 a week?
Well,
especially if you have a family.
And go back to Nathan's point about who's most likely to recidivate. And
Those people are.
So it's like, okay, especially if you're in because you were selling, you were like making thousands of dollars a week.
Yeah.
You know, like, you know, no matter how long you're inside, you can get back into that. Easy.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Easy. So like, how much struggle are you willing to put up with?
Mm-hmm.
And it's more than just the employment situation too. Another thing that people don't generally recognize is major apartment complexes and major, you know, different housing situations. They run background checks and they won't rent to people who have felony backgrounds. I know a guy who was making something like $23 an hour as a heavy equipment operator, living in the homeless shelter because he couldn't find anybody who would rent to him. And think about, where in your city is the homeless shelter located?
In the worst part of town.
Is that somewhere that you want to be? Is that somewhere that's going to set you up for success, living just in that environment?
Yeah. Sherry Garcia with Cornbread Hustle, she's posted about it a lot, how even like people that are on her staff now cannot get a place to live and they're living in a hotel.
Mm-hmm.
And they have a good job in an office handling, you know, employee records and stuff like that, working for her, making money, but they're living in a hotel because they can't find anywhere to live.
Right.
Yeah. And there was actually recently, there was a whole article in the New York Times about the long stay hotels, which is really people, because of credit or prior convictions, can't get an affordable lease. The laws in terms of affordability and like minimum rates don't apply to long stay hotels. So people are bouncing between like long stay hotels and and homelessness. And that's, again, like, how are we? So we're going to banish you. We're going to say you're going to do your time and then you're going to be okay. But then you're going to struggle with housing. You're going to struggle with employment.
Mm-hmm.
And like, maybe socially you're going to be okay, but you also spent like a long time away from people, right? Like, so like, you know, if you're lucky, you have friends and family who support you and love you. But when you look at, like, I know, Chris, you made a post about this, is like, most people that are walking out aren't walking out to a crew of 20 people.
Right. Yeah. Like it blew those guys away that there was 20 people, friends and family there waiting on me to get out. And then we caravan back home. Like there was a line of cars going back home. It blew those guys away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you might.
And then, I mean, it might be a little bit different in East Texas because of the cost of housing, but like in Colorado Springs, so the minimum wage here is higher. Minimum wage is $12.35.
Yeah.
So guys can get out and they can expect to make that much. If they're low skill labor, they don't have any trade or they don't have any experience doing anything else, they could probably find something making as much as $15 an hour. So $15 an hour means that you're making somewhere around, what would that be? $600 a week.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That's $600 a week before taxes.
Mhm.
The cheapest 1-bedroom apartment that you will find in this city right now is $1,200 a month.
Yeah.
So after taxes, you're talking about 3 weeks worth of your pay is just going to live. That doesn't include your car. That doesn't include your food. That doesn't include insurance. That doesn't include your parole fees. That doesn't include
Any of that.
And if you want to buy a house because you can't find anyone who will rent to you, if you
Yeah.
want to buy a house, the cheapest place in the worst side of town is going to be about $300,000.
Hmm.
Who's in a position to pay that, period, much less you can't find decent employment? And
what's your credit score like? Are you going to have to
right.
put down 20% to get that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's
And then all of a sudden your buddy from 10 years ago calls you and says, hey, you want to make 10 grand real quick?
Yeah.
it's hard to say no.
Yeah, it
Right.
is.
It is.
I mean, even people who are trying to do the right thing, it's like everything is set up against you. And like you were talking about before, when it comes to, it's not a matter of the problem being the problem, it's what triggered the problem. How many triggers are being put in these people's paths?
Yeah.
And all it takes is just that bad mood, that wrong day, that right phone call, and all of a sudden they're back in the game.
Yeah.
Where if we had some restorative justice where there was stuff out there that would
Mm-hmm.
that was geared, and we talked about this in the first one, there's a little bit the parole office does for you.
Mm-hmm.
My parole officer is a great guy, but he's got 50 people on his caseload.
Mm-hmm.
And even if 5 of them are knuckleheads, that's 5 people he's got to deal with.
Yeah.
Deal with.
Yeah.
Not to mention the office visits and the house calls and all this other stuff they have to do. They don't have the time, even if they wanted to help out more, they don't have the time or the resources to do it. All the help you really get is job postings on the bulletin board at the parole office. And it's not my parole officer's fault. Like he lets me go and do what he doesn't let a lot of other people go and do because I don't give him any problems. But that's his limit of what he can do, because he just doesn't have the time or the resources to mess with it.
Yeah.
Right. And one of the points I was making is when it comes to the resources that parole does have available for helping guys get jobs and helping guys find housing and whatever else. I mean, I have a master's degree and I have 5 years of experience in data analytics and workforce management.
Mm-hmm.
That's not something parole can help with.
Mm-mm.
No.
They might be able to line up some work in construction or landscaping or maybe a restaurant, but I'm not the typical parole client that they're able to help.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think ultimately, I would love to see more. I think, one of it is that we can rail on media for a long time, but I think, there is just kind of going with the social construct is that, we villainize people who have convictions. And it's the big bad criminal when it's again, we loop it back, people get to know you. And I'm sure that people getting to know you is changing a lot of minds and you guys showing up on here and having these conversations and making posts. That's why I'm so jazzed to support you anytime I see your post in my feed is that I think the more that we just see humans as humans, the more that we can understand. And we need to approach people with empathy.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where I see the power of restorative justice is that the focus is reintegration into the community, and that it is not there is more. It's a kind of stereotypical restorative program is victim offender mediation, not right at all circumstances. No victim should be forced into it. No offender. There has to be dual consent. It has to be something that is ready and mediated and all of those things. But even if you look at community healing circles, and this goes back to indigenous traditions of this is what you did and this was the harm and this is how it impacted. And it's really what it is a conversation surrounding understanding. And I think what the more that we can unlabel people who have been incarcerated or have been convicted of an offense as criminals and more to see them as humans, then it's okay, this isn't hard. This isn't complicated. And like, you shouldn't have to continue to pay when you've paid already. But I think it is because there's so much fear surrounding crime and what criminals are and who they are. And like, the image that you have in your head when I say criminal looks nothing like most actual criminals.
Right.
And that was something that my post last week, when I threw out a few of the statistics. So the recidivism rate in the state of Colorado is approximately 50%, according to official state statistics.
Yeah.
The recidivism rate for people who committed another crime, not just went back to prison, but went back for committing another crime, is 8%. 8%.
Yeah.
The one that surprised me, and I cannot stress this enough, it blew my mind when I saw this, the percentage of the adult population in the United States of America with a felony conviction in their background is 8%.
Doesn't it make you just like want to marry up those records and see?
Right.
Like,
so the amount of people going back to prison for committing another crime on parole is no higher than the statistical average of the general population.
And let's clarify why else you could go back to prison for people that don't know. So you can get a technical violation where you're not paying your fees, you don't have a job when you're supposed to have a job, you missed an office visit, you violate any of the technical conditions of your parole, they can send you back.
Right.
And in some cases, they can take your street time away from you. So you start back over with however much time you had when you made parole. Like right now, if I was to go back to prison, if I was to get violated on a technical violation, I would lose the 5 years that I've been out, and I would go back to 8 years instead of almost 14 years of time done. So you can go back for committing another crime, or you can go back for violating the conditions of your parole. A non-criminal offense, non-criminal, you still can go back to prison.
Yeah, and I've seen guys go back for being in an unauthorized location. And that doesn't mean they were in a bar. It means like you had permission to go to this Walmart and you went to that one.
Yes.
that's wild.
Now I've seen them do that on like ankle monitor stuff. I've never seen them do it on.
And I don't want to give the impression that it's like, okay, if you go to the wrong Walmart, they're going to send you back. Like generally these things pile up, and but the straw that breaks the camel's back or whatever it is. But yeah, if you have missed appointments and out of locations, I mean, I saw a guy go back for being in an unauthorized relationship. He had a girlfriend,
and the parole
an
officer
adult
didn't
consenting girlfriend.
Yep, and the PO didn't approve of it.
That's, at the cost to incarcerate someone, like in my view, in my opinion, prisons are necessary. Like there are people who are dangerous to society and need to be kept away. And we need to help them. And I also am of the opinion that there are some people that are a danger to society that can be helped, that probably will live most of their lives there. And I'm okay with that. However, if someone is, and also when we look at the logistics, what if someone has to live far outside of town because that's the only place that would house them? What if someone's job won't give them time off? What if you're newly out, you have no money, you have no car, you have no transport, you got to take 3 buses to get there. And one bus cancels, you're late. Right.
So instead of a lunch hour trip to go see your parole, where it takes you, an hour, like me, I go see them on my lunch break at the county jail. They go to the county jail in Russ, so I don't have to drive all the way to Tyler. It's 15 minutes away. When I had to go to Tyler, my job was really flexible. That came with being friends with one of the owners. Like they were super, super flexible. But like Jenny said, like I had a car though, but like Jenny said, what about these guys that have to take a bus and it takes them all freaking day to go make a 10-minute appointment?
Yeah.
My husband's like yelling outside the door. I don't know if you guys can hear it.
Right. I know that you said you've got something else going at 7 and we are at that point. So we've done our hour. I'm so thankful that you joined us, Jenny. This was very educational, very
Yes.
very good. I think for our audience included. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah.
So I appreciate you being here, Chris.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Again for you joining us. I love doing these with you, and
Yeah,
I
I
know
do
that we
too.
have another one planned. I don't remember who you said you have, but 2
His
weeks
name
from
is
today.
Yep, his name is Brandon Warren. I need to get with him and make sure he's still good with it. It's been a while
Okay.
since I've talked to him. He got out. He has a PhD now, and he has a YouTube channel called Brandon's Commentary where he does 3 to 5 minute videos on stuff. Really good stuff. Really down to earth. Really, I mean, just shows that you can get out and get a PhD. He graduated from Sam Houston State University with a doctorate in something. I don't remember what it was, but he lays some real down to earth advice for guys getting out of prison. What works, what doesn't work, real practical stuff. That's what I'm looking for. So he's supposed to be on with us.
Okay.
And he's
So
from
that's
Texas too. Yep, 2 weeks from today.
2 weeks from today. Next week, I have Gregor Gregorian joining me on Wednesdays at my normal time. So thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we will see you around.
Bye, y'all. Thank you.